Wow, 3 times a victim, living under the shadow of toxic shame. Yeah, I mean, that title, it really gets to you, doesn't it? Just makes you think, what could someone possibly go through to feel that kind of weight? So today, we are going to try to unpack Bruce's story, all based on the sources you sent over. And yeah, it's heavy stuff, but important.
It is. You're right. It's heavy. The material we have here, it describes like a truly shocking chain of events that Bruce went through. Starts with, believe it or not, a violent attack, physical assault, right in his own apartment. And the attacker is his landlord's wife. But then, and this is what really gets me, he ends up being falsely accused of sexual assault by the very same woman who attacked him. It's a crazy situation, right? Like how easily things can get twisted around, victim and accused, all blurred.
Absolutely. And, the assault and then the false accusation, they're awful enough on their own.
Yeah.
But reading through Bruce's story, it becomes clear. These things, they're not isolated incidents. They kind of opened up this whole well of like deeper trauma from his past.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to try to understand today. Not just what happened that day, but how his whole life, his childhood, everything that happened before, how it all fed into his reaction to this injustice and this ongoing battle he talks about with, as he calls it, toxic shame.
Uh-huh.
We're lucky enough to have some of Bruce's own reflections on his early years, so we'll be diving into those too.
Yeah, and what hits you right away in Bruce's story is how sudden and violating that first attack was.
Yeah.
He opens his door thinking it's a friend, and it's his landlord's wife, and she just forces her way and locks the door behind her. Can you imagine feeling trapped like that in your own home? It's like your safe space is totally violated, right?
Hey, absolutely. And the attack itself, the way he describes it, it's brutal. The punches, the blood, his glasses knocked off his face. But he's very clear that he didn't fight back. It was all about survival in that moment, the shock of it.
Yeah.
Even as he's like dragging her out of his apartment to call 911, he's worried about hurting her. I mean, that's amazing restraint.
Total restraint. And then think about this. The moment he hears that police radio transmission, it says, a woman was sexually assaulted here. That's just, wow. I mean, he's the one who called for help. He's the one who was attacked. And instantly he becomes the accused. It's mind-blowing.
Right. He's standing there injured. He called for help. And suddenly the whole story gets flipped. And the perpetrator, we should say her name, Anna Ensof Amadorizo, she's seen as the victim by the police. That's the first layer of him being victimized that day.
Exactly. And, when we think about how an event like that could affect someone who might already be struggling, Bruce is pretty open about his past. He talks about how this whole thing brought back this lifelong struggle with what he calls toxic shame and social anxiety, self-doubt, all stemming from his childhood. It makes you wonder, right, how trauma can trigger those old feelings, those unresolved things from the past.
Yeah, he actually mentions how hard he worked to overcome shyness, even selective mutism, when he was in college. All because he wanted a career helping others.
Yeah.
Talk about resilience, right?
Yeah.
Trying to break free from those internal barriers. It's incredible.
And there's this really touching part where he talks about how his relationships, first with Celta and then with Lynn, how their love was like a reprieve from toxic shame. He felt seen, valued. It shows how powerful those positive connections can be, like an antidote to those deep feelings of unworthiness. But it also makes you think, right, how does such a huge injustice, like this assault, how does it interact with those old wounds that were starting to heal?
It's like pouring salt on an open wound, isn't it? Like reopening those scars. So to understand how deeply this affected Bruce, we need to look at where that toxic shame comes from, right? Go back to his childhood. He mentions this swimming pool incident. And it might seem like a small thing, a childhood memory, but the way he describes it, it's clearly a turning point.
Yeah, picture this. A little kid, terrified, falls into the deep end of a pool. He gets rescued, held by the swimming instructor. You'd expect relief, right? But Bruce, he says the comfort he felt was something I wasn't meant to have. And he calls this moment the birth of shame. It just shows how a seemingly small event can get twisted in a child's mind and create these core beliefs about whether they deserve good things. This feeling of not meant to have, it can stick with you.
That is so powerful. Like a child internalizing being cared for as something bad. I think it's another example about being afraid of fire truck sirens as a kid. And his parents, they laughed at him, dismissed his fear, never comforted him.
And that's what's so damaging, right? That lack of consistent care, that emotional attunement, it can really mess with the kid's development. They internalize this feeling that they're not worthy of comfort. And it's interesting because later in life, he describes how he soothes his cat when it's scared. Like he instinctively provides that comfort he never got, which I think shows how deeply he understands that need for safety and reassurance.
And these aren't just isolated moments. They're part of this bigger picture, this really tough family environment he describes as, and I'm quoting here, the house of unspoken rules and child abuse. He talks about his dad's unshakable silence and his mom as a storm you learn to anticipate. It's like this constant tension, this chill in the air, and the expectation that you just submit. That's not a safe or loving environment.
And he's honest about the physical abuse, too, the assault that happened in the family. We don't know exactly who was doing what to whom in those early years, but the overall impact is clear. No tenderness, no joy, even though they did the quote-unquote normal family things like trips to Disney World, having a pool. He says it wasn't love that motivated them, it was obligation.
But then there's this contrast, right? His maternal grandparents, they were different. He calls them a refuge, a shield, like even his grandmother just telling his parents not to hurt him and his grandfather showing concern. Those small things meant the world to him. Losing them after they died must have been devastating.
Absolutely. It shows how important those even small moments of safety and connection are for a child and how much it hurts when they're gone. But it wasn't all bad, right? Bruce also talks about his cousins, Barbara and Dan, and how much he loved being with them, taking care of the younger ones. He clearly has this capacity for connection, for nurturing.
Yeah, those relationships with his cousins, they were like a breath of fresh air for him. Warmth, laughter, even physical affection with Barbara. But then his mom, she would get jealous, planting these seeds of doubt, asking him if his cousins would let you live with them, implying he was a burden for wanting to be close to them.
And that's so messed up, right? It undermines those healthy relationships, reinforces that feeling that wanting affection is wrong, like that swimming pool incident all over again. He even says he learned to doubt every warm moment, to question every innocent connection that can really damage a child's ability to trust and connect with people.
And it probably played a role in him developing selective mutism in junior high. He says at school, speaking felt like exposure, like it was tied to that shame he carried. Silence became his protection, an invisible shell to avoid judgment and pain.
Right. But it's important to remember, it wasn't that he couldn't speak at all. He was fine outside of school, talking to customers on his paper route, at his job at the medical mart. It was specific to the school environment, probably because that's where he felt the most vulnerable, the most exposed, right?
Absolutely. But in the middle of all this, he tells this powerful story. He was fighting with his sister, and he raised his hand to hit her. But something stopped him. He saw her fear, and it changed everything for him.
That moment, it was like a wake-up call. He makes this vow to himself, and I'm quoting again, "I will never become like them. I will never lose my temper. I will never let anyone feel unsafe because of me." It's like this commitment to break the cycle, to not pass on the hurt he experienced.
It's amazing, right? His resilience, this choice to build a different life for himself. And it connects to this description his mom had for him, house devil, street angel. He admits there's truth to it. At home, he was quiet, tense, always on edge. But outside, he says he saved my kindness for those who deserved it, the people who didn't make him feel afraid.
Yeah, it's like he had to live these two separate lives. The chaos and harshness at home, it forced him to be guarded. But the outside world, that's where he could be himself, kind and connected. And then he ends that section by saying he longed for parents, just not mine. It really sums up how those early experiences shaped him. His longing for that safe, loving home he never had.
So putting it all together, it's clear how everything connects. That assault in his apartment, it ripped open those old wounds of shame he'd been carrying since childhood. That lack of love and safety, the constant tension from his parents, it all laid the groundwork for those feelings of unworthiness that he still struggles with.
And it's so powerful that even as a kid in that messed up environment, he made that promise to himself to never be the one who caused fear. And then later, that false accusation, it was like the ultimate test of that vow. His commitment to not become like his parents, to never make anyone feel unsafe. That's a constant theme in his story.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How much those early experiences shape us and how they influence how we react to trauma and injustice later in life. Bruce's story, it's personal, but it also sheds light on these hidden wounds so many people carry. It's a call for empathy, right?
Yeah.
To remember that we don't know what others have been through.
It is. What do you think, though, about Bruce's story? I mean, going through all that pain, and it leads him to want to protect others from feeling that same pain, to prevent it. What does that say about the potential for good to come out of suffering, even really difficult stuff like this?
That's such a good question. I think Bruce's story shows us that even in the darkest places, there's this possibility for transformation. That vow he made as a kid, after seeing his sister's fear, it shows his empathy, his decision to break the cycle. And then that injustice he faced as an adult, it didn't just crush him, it actually seemed to strengthen his resolve to live by that vow, to not cause harm, maybe even to help others who've been hurt. It's a testament to human resilience and finding meaning even in the face of awful things. His story becomes more than just a story of being a victim. It's also a story of healing and trying to live a better way.
It really does. It makes you wonder about how those early experiences shape our whole lives and what it takes to not just survive, but to choose compassion and responsibility, like Bruce has. It's a powerful reminder that those early years matter, and that even the deepest wounds can become a source of empathy, a drive to make the world a safer place.
It leaves us with a lot to think about, doesn't it?
It does.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.